Imagine being trapped behind barbed wire, watched day and night by armed guards, with nothing in your pockets but a bent spoon stolen from the mess hall. Now imagine using that spoon to dig a tunnel 30 feet long, deep enough to pass under a guard tower, wide enough to crawl through on your belly in total darkness, breathing air that grew thinner with every foot you advanced. This is not fiction. This is one of the most astonishing true stories of human determination ever recorded. A story where ordinary men, stripped of every weapon and every tool, turned the most unremarkable object in their daily lives into the key to their freedom. It happened during the Second World War, inside a prisoner of war camp where thousands of captured soldiers were held behind double fences of barbed wire, under floodlights that swept the compound every few seconds, with guard dogs patrolling the perimeter and machine gun nests positioned at every corner. The Germans running these camps believed they had thought of everything. They searched barracks. They counted prisoners multiple times a day. They listened for the sound of digging with seismographic microphones buried in the ground. They believed escape was nearly impossible, and for most prisoners, it was. But a small group of men refused to accept that. They had no shovels, no picks, no proper tools of any kind, because every object that could be used to dig was confiscated on sight. What they did have was access to the camp kitchen, where simple metal spoons were used to serve watery soup and stale bread. Nobody thought twice about a spoon. Guards did not count them. Officers did not inspect them. A spoon was beneath suspicion, a tool so ordinary that it was invisible. And that is exactly why it became the perfect weapon against captivity. Over the following months, a handful of prisoners would smuggle spoons out of the kitchen one at a time, bending the handles, sharpening the edges against stone, turning kitchen utensils into makeshift digging tools. They began their tunnel beneath a bunk bed, in a spot chosen because it was hidden from the window where guards conducted random checks. Every scrape of metal against soil had to be muffled. Every grain of displaced earth had to be hidden, because dirt piled outside a tunnel entrance was the single most common reason escape attempts were discovered. What followed was months of grueling, claustrophobic, dangerous labor, performed in secret, performed in fear, performed by men who knew that if they were caught, the punishment could be solitary confinement, brutal beatings, or worse. Yet they kept digging, spoonful by spoonful, inch by inch, driven by something stronger than exhaustion, the desperate hope of seeing home again. Stay with this story, because what these men accomplished with nothing but spoons and sheer willpower is one of the most remarkable feats of ingenuity to come out of the entire war, and the way it unfolded will leave you questioning just how far the human spirit can be pushed before it finds a way through. The men who began this tunnel were not engineers or miners. They were ordinary soldiers, airmen, and infantrymen who had been shot down, captured or overrun in battle, then shipped to a camp far from the front lines, where escape seemed like a fantasy reserved for storybooks. But prisoner of war camps during the Second World War were strange places, filled with idle time and restless minds. Men who had once flown bombers or commanded tanks now spent their days doing almost nothing, and that emptiness became fertile ground for obsession. Escape committees formed inside many camps, secret organizations that planned, funded, and coordinated attempts to break free. These committees decided who could dig, who would stand watch, who would forge documents, and who would create civilian clothing from old uniforms. The tunnel dug with spoons began as a simple idea whispered between 2 or 3 trusted prisoners, men who had noticed a weakness in the floorboards beneath their bunk and who understood that the soil beneath the camp was soft enough to be moved by hand if they were patient. They started at night, working in shifts so that the sound of digging never lasted long enough to draw attention. One man would dig while another stood watch near the barracks door, ready to give a signal if a guard approached. The spoons wore down quickly, the metal bending and snapping under the strain of cutting through packed earth, so the prisoners constantly needed replacements, sneaking utensils out of the kitchen during meal duty, hiding them in clothing, in boots, in hollowed-out bread. Every spoon that disappeared was a risk, because if the kitchen staff noticed a pattern of missing utensils, suspicion would rise immediately. To manage this, the men spread out their thefts across weeks, taking only 1 or 2 at a time, never enough to be obvious, always enough to keep the work moving forward. As the tunnel grew longer, new problems emerged that the prisoners had never anticipated. Digging straight down was relatively simple, but extending a tunnel horizontally for dozens of feet meant the diggers had to work lying flat on their stomachs, in spaces barely large enough to fit a human body. The deeper they went, the harder it became to breathe, because fresh air could not reach the working face of the tunnel. Some prisoners reported feeling dizzy, lightheaded, and disoriented after spending too long underground, a clear sign of oxygen deprivation in the narrow shaft. To solve this, the men devised crude ventilation systems, using whatever materials they could scavenge, including hollowed-out tin cans connected end to end, to form a makeshift air pipe that ran from the surface down into the tunnel. They also built small carts from scraps of wood to haul dirt out of the tunnel more efficiently, sliding them along makeshift rails made from bed frame supports, since carrying soil by hand in buckets was painfully slow and increased the risk of spillage that could be spotted by guards. Every bucket of displaced dirt had to disappear without a trace, and prisoners became remarkably creative in solving this problem, sewing extra pockets into their trousers to carry small amounts of soil outside during daily exercise periods, then releasing it slowly as they walked across the yard so it blended into the existing ground. Some camps saw prisoners spreading dirt beneath garden plots they had been given permission to cultivate, using the cover of farming to dispose of evidence. The psychological toll of this work cannot be overstated. Men spent hours each night crawling through total darkness, surrounded by dirt walls that could collapse at any moment, knowing that a cave-in could mean being buried alive, with no way to call for help without exposing the entire operation. Despite the danger, morale among the diggers remained remarkably high, fueled by small victories, each additional foot of tunnel representing tangible progress toward freedom. They marked their progress secretly, tracking how far they had advanced and roughly calculating how much further they needed to dig before reaching beyond the outer fence and the watchtowers that loomed above the compound. Meanwhile, guards conducted their routine patrols, completely unaware that beneath their boots, a network of prisoners was inching closer to escape, using nothing more sophisticated than bent spoons and raw determination. The camp authorities had safeguards in place specifically designed to detect tunneling, including microphones buried at intervals around the perimeter fence meant to pick up the vibrations of digging. The prisoners countered this threat by timing their work around the patrol schedules, digging only during specific windows when they believed detection equipment was least likely to be monitored, and by keeping their movements as gentle and controlled as possible to minimize vibration. As weeks turned into months, the tunnel slowly stretched toward its goal, a length of earth that represented not just physical distance, but the accumulated hope of every man involved in its construction. The risk of discovery never disappeared. Random barracks inspections continued, and prisoners had to disguise the tunnel entrance so convincingly that even a careful search would miss it, often using a section of floorboard that could be lifted and replaced perfectly, concealed beneath a stove or a stack of personal belongings. Trust was essential because the success of the entire operation depended on every prisoner in the barracks staying silent, even those not directly involved in the digging. A single careless word, overheard by an informant or a guard who understood enough of the prisoner's language, could end the entire effort instantly. The longer the tunnel grew, the greater the stakes became, and the men working the spoons night after night understood that they were now too deep into the project to turn back, even as the danger surrounding them intensified with every foot of progress. Eventually, after months of relentless effort, the tunnel reached a length sufficient to pass beneath the outer fence and emerge in the tree line beyond the camp, far enough from the watchtowers that an escaping prisoner would have a genuine chance of disappearing into the surrounding countryside before being spotted. The night chosen for the escape attempt was selected carefully, often based on weather conditions, since heavy rain or fog could mask the sound and sight of men emerging from the ground and moving toward freedom. Tension inside the barracks that night would have been almost unbearable, every prisoner aware that the months of secret labor were about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible. One by one, the chosen escapees crawled through the narrow passage their comrades had carved out with nothing but spoons and sheer persistence, moving slowly to avoid making noise, pushing through sections of the tunnel so tight that their shoulders scraped against the earthen walls on both sides. Emerging from the exit point beyond the fence was perhaps the most dangerous moment of the entire operation, because this was the instant when a prisoner was most exposed, climbing out of a hole in the ground in plain view of anyone who happened to be looking in the wrong direction at the wrong time. Some escape attempts throughout the war ended in tragedy at exactly this moment, with prisoners shot or recaptured within seconds of reaching the surface. Others succeeded in slipping away into darkness, beginning a perilous journey across hostile territory, relying on forged documents, scavenged civilian clothing, and whatever rudimentary language skills they possessed to avoid capture as they tried to reach neutral territory or friendly lines. The stories that emerged from these escapes varied wildly. Some men were recaptured within days, returned to the camp to face punishment that ranged from extended solitary confinement to transfer to a more heavily guarded facility. Others managed to evade capture for weeks, surviving on stolen food, sleeping in barns and forests, moving only at night to avoid detection. A small number of escapees from tunnels like this one actually succeeded in reaching freedom entirely, crossing into neutral countries or linking up with resistance networks that helped smuggle them back to friendly territory where they were celebrated as heroes and symbols of unbreakable resolve. Whether or not every escapee succeeded, the tunnel itself stood as a profound testament to what desperate, determined people can accomplish when given nothing but time, patience, and the most ordinary tools imaginable. The story of the Spoon Tunnel spread among prisoners in other camps, inspiring similar attempts elsewhere, as word passed through covert channels that escape was possible even under the most impossible conditions, as long as men were willing to dedicate themselves entirely to the effort. Historians who have studied these wartime escape attempts often point to stories like this as evidence of something deeper than mere tactical cleverness. They reveal the lengths to which human beings will go to reclaim their freedom, even when every obstacle seems designed specifically to crush that hope. A spoon, an object so mundane that it barely registers in daily life, became in the hands of these prisoners an instrument of liberation, proof that resourcefulness and willpower can overcome shortages of equipment, technology, and resources. The guards who patrolled that camp never imagined that the simple utensils used to serve soup each evening were quietly being transformed into tools of rebellion, carried piece by piece into the darkness beneath their feet. Decades later, the story of the tunnel dug with spoons continues to circulate as one of the most powerful examples of human ingenuity under extreme duress. A reminder that the most ordinary objects can become extraordinary when wielded by people who refuse to surrender their hope. It stands today not just as a tale of escape, but as a lasting symbol of what it means to resist captivity with nothing but patience, courage, and a willingness to dig, one spoonful at a time, toward freedom.